Had a thought today from the book of Hosea, chapter number 4, about a lack of knowledge. And in order for us to understand the concept of this, I think we need to just set a little bit of a foundation. We see here in Hosea, he is a prophet to Israel, which at this point was before they went into captivity, understanding that there was a split in the children of Israel, that 2.5 tribes went with Judah, and then the other tribes went to Israel. So you see a split that happened there, and then there was basically 2 kingdoms that were set up. Israel never had a good king, from what I've studied out, after really King Solomon. Rehoboam came on the scene, wanted to tax them more, and that's what caused the civil unrest. And then Jeroboam took the large part of the nation and started another nation, basically. And now Judah actually had some good kings, and that's the reason why I feel like that they lasted a little bit longer before they went into the Babylonian captivity later on. But Israel went into the Assyrian captivity. And so basically my point here with a lack of knowledge is that from that point there wasn't good leadership. There wasn't really a desire to follow after the Lord. In Israel, there was very few that we read that really wanted to follow after and would command and would try, and we read that in the prophets, but there was always a rejection of that. So that brings us to chapter number 4 of Hosea, one of the prophets that's telling them, "Hear the Lord, or hear the word of the Lord, rather, ye children of Israel, for the Lord hath a controversy with the inhabitants of the land, because there is no truth, nor mercy," and then listen, "nor knowledge of God in the land." And then in verse 2 it says, "By swearing and lying and killing and stealing and committing adultery, they break out, and blood toucheth blood." And then we move down to verse number 6, and this is what I was thinking about here today. "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because thou hast rejected knowledge, I will also reject thee, that thou shalt be no priest to me." And then listen to this, and this is really the kicker and what I will conclude with here in a few moments. "Seeing thou hast forgotten the law of God," listen to what the results of this is, "I will also forget thy children." I hate that. It's such a horrible picture here. So let's just kind of break this down. The prophet's saying, listen, hear the word of the Lord. He's trying to get them to turn before they go into bondage. They're literally headed towards Assyrian captivity, and the prophet's trying to tell them, you need to know truth and mercy, and you need to have a knowledge of God in the land. But instead what we're getting is swearing and lying and killing and stealing and adultery. And then he goes on to say, "My people are destroyed." They're destroyed because of this lack of knowledge. And the lack of knowledge, tying in with that first verse, is just basically telling us that there is a lack of knowledge of God and of his precepts. There's a lack of knowledge because there was a lack of leadership. The Israelites, Israel, take into consideration being split off of Judah, Israel, the kingdom of Israel. We see here, this is what they're dealing with. They have no good king. They have no good leadership. And so it's leading them down this way. So there wasn't someone who could share that knowledge of God with them. And then we see, not only is there a lack of knowledge because there wasn't any leadership, but the leadership that they did have, such as this prophet, who was trying to tell them and wake them up there was no reception of that word. They said, we don't want anything to do with that type of enlightenment that you're trying to give us. We don't want it. And then we read later on in the same chapter in verse number 16, it says, Israel slideth back. And they were backsliding. This whole chapter is about that. It's beautiful, or this whole book rather. This Hosea is a very beautiful picture of what God can do with people that will turn to Him. But we see this destruction here because of the lack of knowledge. And then he says, because you've rejected that knowledge, I'm going to reject you. And that's so vital for us to get a hold of. We cannot reject the knowledge of God and the knowledge of His precepts. Whenever we are confronted with truth, we have to be able to receive that truth. So we see that there was a lack of leadership, there was a lack of reception to truth. And I think when you have a lack of leadership and a lack of reception to the truth, then you have a lack of application. And how can you apply something that you're not willing to gain knowledge of? And so if they're not applying the precepts of His Word and applying, then we see them veering off. And the most devastating thing about this chapter here that we see them, he says, you're rejecting, I'm going to reject. But then he goes on and he says, seeing thou hast forgotten the law of thy God, I will also forget thy children. And I guess that's really what just really gripped me here today. When we allow for ourselves to reject and not to prioritize God and not to put Him in His rightful place, and we're not receptive to His words, and we're not receptive to His precepts, and we don't have Him where He's supposed to be in our lives, then who really pays for this? It's our kids. Our kids really pay. If we don't, the Bible says that we should raise them up in the way they should go, and when they're old, they will not depart from it. Now, I want to encourage you here today that does not just mean taking them to church, but we are to get that knowledge of God, that presence of God in our homes. All throughout the Bible, we read about how important it is for us to talk about God when we wake up in the morning, when we go to bed, when we're on the road walking, when it's so important for us to keep God in His rightful place. And I just want to encourage somebody here today that's listened to this small devotion here today to make sure that you're doing everything that you can to get God in your home, to get God His presence and His precepts, not only in your home, but in your hearts and in your kids' hearts. And if we can do what we need to do to keep that knowledge of God, to keep that presence of God, to keep those precepts of God, if we can do what we need to do, then our children will reap the benefits of knowing God. But if we reject and if we don't apply, then our kids are going to see the results of a lack of knowledge, and that's what we read about here today. So I want to encourage you. I'm going to end off with chapter number 6 and verse 1 says, Come, let us return unto the Lord, for He hath torn, and He will heal us. He has smitten, and He will bind us up. So the most awesome thing about it is if you haven't done everything right so far, then you can still. There's still hope. Get God in His rightful place, and then watch as everything around you benefits from you putting God where He's supposed to be. I appreciate your time here today. God bless you. Hope you have a wonderful, wonderful day.